So this is the first part of the talk, and the title is, like I said, Who is Jesus? And the first thing I'd say is, I don't know how many of you have come across The Chosen, this series. There's a few hands. Right, let me just say a couple of things about this, because one of the things that maybe comes out of this talk is that you go home, find your computer, your internet, your phone, whatever, and go onto this website. The website looks like this. It's free. And it was, The Chosen was started in 2017, as you can see here, and 2017 TV series, and it is a retelling of the story of Jesus. Now, there's been lots of retellings down through history, of course, and normally they're like a 2-hour movie. The advantage with this is that it's a series, which means it's a 1-hour session, but there's so many series. So they're only halfway through Jesus' life, and I think it's been about 20 or 25 hours so far. So it's absolutely terrific. It is crowd-funded, which maybe you don't always necessarily know what that means, but basically, the guy the Catholic man who is the director of it, he managed to raise £11 million to get the whole thing off the ground. And then, from then on, they've crowdfunded it. And it's been the largest crowdfunding in the entertainment business in the whole world project. It's unbelievable. In fact, Disney are trying to learn from them now because it's been so popular. They reckon 200 million people have seen some of these series. So at the other church that I work in, every Wednesday, the third Wednesday of every month, we meet together to watch one series and then we discuss it. And one of the discussion points that always comes up is, well, I didn't see that in the Bible. And it's because they're having to add a lot of extra stories to make sense of what we have in the Gospels. And there's always this debate as to whether we should do that. But then somebody realized that actually every time somebody preaches, they take a passage that you can read, like Margaret just did, in about a minute and a half, and we expand it to 30 minutes, and we try to bring our own lives into it and kind of root it into real life. So essentially, that's the way I would see The Chosen is doing that, but in a video movie form. It's free to watch, but as you can see here, you can click on this and pay something so that somebody else in the future can watch it for free. So it's a lovely way of getting the whole world to kind of reach out to itself and pay it forward. And one of the powerful things I think about The Chosen is there's a very fresh and valuable look at the person of Jesus, and they really develop the characters. And the reason I'm going on about this now is because when we ask the question, who is Jesus, we are not just looking for an answer that can be written down on a piece of paper. We're looking for an encounter with a person, because God actually took on human flesh, and that's what we're going to be looking at now. So when you go home, ideally not yet, but when you go home or sometime, find The Chosen, just Google it. It's Angel Studios. It's free to watch. You can watch as many episodes as you like, and it's a fascinating way to revisit the same story that we have in 4 biographies here in the Bible. So we're looking at this one, and I thought today, rather than me telling you who I think Jesus is, I'm going to start by getting some quotes as to who people have thought Jesus is historically. So this was the first one. Jesus was God spelling himself out in language humanity could understand. Jesus was God spelling himself out in language humanity could understand. I don't know if you've ever thought about what if God was trying to get through to us and show us who he is, what would be the best way to do that? Now, you might say, well, creation tells us something about God. If we believe God's a creator, then we can look at creation and we can say, well, he's certainly got an eye for beauty. He's got an eye for grandeur. He loves things that grow. You know, there's a lot you could kind of tell about God through creation. But how would God get through to you if he wanted to get through to you, let's say? Some people might think, well, if I could see my name in clouds, Sean, I'm here, written in clouds, would that help? But then, actually, in today's world, we're often doubt even what we see, don't we? Because we think, oh, that's just manipulated, or that's just some sort of whatever. I would argue that the best way for God to get through to us would be to become one of us. Because while God is up there, massive and mighty, he's also very distant, or at least he feels distant. And there's a tendency as human beings that when God's not very close to us, we end up kind of making him into our image. So we end up thinking, well, this is what I like to think of God. This is the way I like to see God. And we kind of make him into in our image. But if he actually came into this world as one of us, then we're talking about somebody we can really get to know rather than just, I like to think of God like this. So this S.D. Gordon said this. Here's another quote by George Whitefield. George Whitefield, as you can see, lived a long time ago, nearly 300 years ago. He preached in Kingswood, which is near to where I live, but he became famous for, he went across America. They think he preached 18,000 times to perhaps 10 million people. This is in the days before the internet. So to preach to 10 million people literally is 10 million human beings listening to you like this with no microphones. So George Whitefield had a remarkable and an incredible ministry. He worked with John and Charles Wesley, and we probably know about them. Here's what Whitefield said, and I find this really, really helpful. Jesus was God and man in one person, that God and man might be happy together again. Jesus was God and man in one person, that God and man might be happy together again. The other day, I was in the classrooms of a little primary school near to Severn Beach, and talking about Jesus coming just before Christmas, Jesus coming, the incarnation, Mary, and so I just said about, Mary was the mother of Jesus, but God was the father. And this little kid said, how? How can that happen? And it dawned on me, right, live in front of the children. One of the reasons why I love answering questions for children is that I learn as much as they do. I'd never really thought about it, but they say the male sperm cell is one of the smallest cells in the human body. And if you think about it, that's all that God had to give to Mary, one of the smallest cells in the human body, to grow the person of Jesus inside Mary, and then 9 months later to enter this world, the way that every single one of us has entered this world. So Whitefield says, Jesus was God and man in one person. And you could preach on this for 20 hours, I'm sure. Just think about it for a moment. If God can take on human flesh like we've got, without morphing it or changing it into some sort of fantastical thing, then that says a lot about God. Sometimes we think God is so big, he can't even fit in this whole world. Well, actually, no. He was able to enter the womb of a woman. Sometimes you think God is so powerful, he could just smite anybody like that. Well, actually, God was so small and vulnerable that he is dependent on a woman. So it begins to change how we see the nature of God, to think that God could become one of us. Now, here's another picture from The Chosen. And here is Charles Spurgeon, one of the great preachers in the United Kingdom, who lived 150-odd years ago, or something like that, quite a long time ago, 130 years ago maybe now. And here's what he said, and I really, this will unpack further what we're thinking about. Jesus was infinite and an infant. In other words, he was outside of time, but he chose to humbly enter time and be restricted to it just like you and I are. He was eternal and yet born of a woman. He was almighty and yet hanging on a woman's breast. Imagine that. Jesus was dependent on Mary for food at one point in his life. What kind of a God would do that? Well, it's interesting. When God defines himself, he doesn't primarily say, I'm the great and mighty one. In John's gospel, or in the letter that John wrote, he says, God is love. Now, when we think about love, we don't necessarily think about size or power or the ability to control or manipulate. We think about giving, about serving. And it turns out love can go to the smallest details. So if we've tended to think of God as big and a bit far away, remember he defines himself as love. And love can be as small as it needs to be to get into the tiniest little doubt in your heart. Supporting a universe and yet needing to be carried in a mother's arms. I don't know if you think big, strong people never should be helped. Sometimes, particularly as men, we find it very, very hard to be helped because that seems to be a sign of weakness. But then as we mature, sometimes we realize, no, it's a sign of strength. To be able to ask for help is one of the hardest things in life. It's a sign of strength. And God seemed to have no problem in being dependent on a woman. He was the king of angels and yet reputed the son of Joseph. And finally, he is the heir of all things and yet the carpenter's despised son. So this is some of the challenges that we have in trying to understand who Jesus is. Now, I just wanted to bring us back to this just before I stop my little bit. This is the reading that we had, which we just had read out. Because Jesus is walking along the road, and he asks the disciples closest to him, who do people say that I am? And people say, well, people say you're a prophet. People say maybe you're John the Baptist. People say you're something. And then he asks Peter, but who do you say I am? Now remember, Peter's been following him for quite a while now. And Peter's got to know who he is. And this is what Peter says. You are the Christ, which is the Greek word, or the Messiah, which is the Hebrew word. In other words, you're the one we've all been waiting for. You are it. You are the solution to our problems. You are the one who's going to make things better. So what I was hoping to just look at was, do you remember when the reading was read and Jesus saw a blind man and he spat, didn't he? And he put his hands on this man's eyes and he said to the man, do you see? And the man said, well, I can see people, but they look like trees. In other words, it's very blurry, right? Now, if you go around with your eyes like this, where you can basically just see somebody, but you can't see their expression, it's not actually very helpful because you can't see the expression or what people are trying to say. You can't read. It's very, very limiting. It's actually not a lot better than being totally blind because everything's blurred. Now, the question is, why did Jesus take 2 times to heal this man? Because never before did Jesus need 2 goes at healing somebody. And so Jesus asked that question, and then Jesus touches his eyes again, and then he opens his eyes fully. As though it's possible to see in a way that's actually not very clear and really not that helpful, or to have your eyes fully opened, and at that point, you see in the way that your eyes were meant to see all along. Now that's the miracle, right? And you sort of think, what's the point of that? And then we get onto this story, this immediate thing. Jesus says, who do people say I am? And Peter gets it right, doesn't he? He says, you are the Messiah. You're the one we've been waiting for. And then Jesus says, right, this is what's going to happen to me. Oh, let's see what we've got. I forgot about this. Do you see anything? He looked up. I see people, they look like trees, walk around. So that's the miracle. And then Peter says this, you're the Messiah, as though he's arrived. We can all go home now. Somebody's correctly identified Jesus. And then Jesus says, he began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things, be rejected by the elders, the chief priests, the teachers of the law, that he must be killed, and after 3 days rise again. He spoke plainly about this And Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. Hang on, this is the Peter who just saw who Jesus is. So I think this Peter is a bit like the blind man who can only see like this. He's seen that Jesus is the Messiah, and it's very dangerous if Peter goes around telling everybody Jesus is the Messiah without understanding how Jesus is the Messiah. Here's the thing that actually very few people have understood. Why did Jesus have to die? And we're going to touch on this, of course, at Easter. But for now, I just wanted to land with this. Roger just mentioned this prophecy. Now, Isaiah wrote this between 800 or maybe 600 years before Jesus came. And this is what Isaiah said. It was the Lord's will to crush him, this Messiah, to cause him to suffer. And though the Lord makes his life an offering for sin, he will see his offspring and prolong his days, and the will of the Lord will prosper in his hand. So this is a whole chapter. I'm just going to mention one thing. Let me just tell you a story to try to illustrate this, and then with this, we're going to pretty much finish. 3 years ago, I was doing a teaching degree. Just the PGCE, which is a one-year thing. And Rob was on this course with me. And Rob is a Christadelphian. I'd never met a Christadelphian before, but apparently in Keynsham, near to where I am, there's a Christadelphian church. And so he and I got discussing what this meant. And of course, a bit like what Tim was saying with regard to the Muslim man he was talking to, everybody believes Jesus existed, right? In fact, some people even believe, that Jesus is a prophet, a great teacher, a great whatever. But that's as far as they go. And I would argue that's like having your eyes opened enough to be able to see people, but they look like trees. You're not going to be able to see expressions, and you can't really use your eyes for what they're for. So why did Jesus have to be God? So here's my illustration. I said to Rob, imagine, now here's about a 25-year-old guy. Imagine you wanted to buy a house. Now, a house is £250,000, and your dad said he will lend you £100,000. And then on top of that, you can get a mortgage, and then you're going to buy a house for yourself, £250,000 house. So you do that. You borrow the money from your dad, you borrow the money from the bank, buy your house, everything's happy, except that then you lose your job. And the bank says, where's my payments? And the bank says, I'm going to repossess your house. And they repossess your house in order to pay them back what they are owed. Now, Rob, you don't have that £100,000 to pay to your dad. Now, here's the question. Imagine I'm talking to you, Rob, and I hear this story, and I'm really moved by it because it wasn't your fault. You're so sad that this happened. And I say to Rob, listen, Rob, forget it. You don't have to pay your dad back. Would that work? Why not? Exactly. I'm not his dad. I'm moved by his story. I'd love to say, Rob, just don't worry about it, buddy. You never, just forget about the debt. But actually, I'm not in a position to cancel that debt because the debt's not against me. I didn't lend him the money. Unless I give him 100,000. Now, I'm not even thinking about doing that. So, now, here's another question. I said, what would happen, Rob, if your mum said, you don't have to pay the £100,000 back? That's a tricky one, isn't it? Because as the father's wife, well, anyway, that's another whole story. But I said, imagine if your dad said to you, Rob, I can see you're never going to pay this £100,000 back. I will forgive you of that debt. I said to Rob, who has just paid the £100,000? And he said, my dad. Do you see what I'm saying? If we lend something to somebody and then it transpires that they can never pay it back and we forgive them of that debt, we have suddenly paid it. We've lost that £100,000, right? Even a child can understand that. So here's the thing. Why did Jesus have to die? And why did Jesus have to be God? Because it's not about how good or bad we are. It goes like this. God is the source of life. He's the one who gave us life. He's the one who sustains life. He's the source of life. Like if I say to you, what's the source of light? You'd say, well, you wouldn't say that light bulb, you'd say the sun is the source of light. Even this light bulb somehow it originally got its energy from the sun. The energy came to Earth, maybe fossil fuels, whatever else, whatever way, somehow that's dependent on the sun. So in the same way, life actually has a source, and that source is God. God is the beginning of life. He's the source of life, the giver of life. Now here's the thing. If we don't let God be God in our lives, then essentially we become our own God. And we looked at that a month ago or 2 months ago with Cafe Church. When we become that God, we are no longer letting God be God. We are now the one who chooses what we do. We're the one who tries to make most of our lives. We're the one who makes sense of all the rest of it. But we're cut off. Why? Because we have cut ourselves off from God. Now you might think, well, I don't need religion. But the thing is, if God is the source of life, then your life is actually dependent on God. And a bit like some of you, I know Kin has an electric car, and I'm sometimes jealous of that, and then I realize, no, I mustn't be jealous. But his electric car can go quite far without plugging into the source of electricity. But at some point, that electricity runs out in his batteries. And we don't die immediately when we're separated from the source of life, because we are given a life that works to some degree. But actually, God says, you were never made to walk alone. You were made to be in touch with the source of life. And the moment that you ask God to be your God, you connect with the giver of life. So here's the thing, going back to Jesus, and with this I'm just about to end. If God cancels our debt, he has to pay for the debt. The £100,000, the life. And that is why Jesus had to give up his life. It wasn't just some arbitrary thing, God saying, right, who can I get? Oh, I know, I'll get my... No. It's this idea that if he's going to give us his life, then he's going to lose it for himself. You see? The Father can't cancel Rob's debt of £100,000 and not lose the £100,000. The £100,000 is gone, and Rob will never pay it back. And he forgives them of that debt, but suddenly in that moment, he's paid for it. And that is what God has done. God is the source of life. And that's why Jesus had to give his life. It's not some sort of cruel trick or joke. It's the simplest thing that works in every single day of our lives. When we lend something to somebody and they, for whatever reason, can't give it back, we have at that moment, if we forgive them, we have let go of that. And we have paid for that ourselves. And that is what Jesus did. And that is why Jesus said, the moment Peter got it right, yes, you're the Messiah, he said, right, the next thing you need to know, the real thing you need to know, is that here's how I'm going to be the Messiah. I'm going to give my life so that you can have my life instead of your death. Let's just ask this same God in prayer to help us to understand and to respond to this. Because the more we know, the more we're able to respond. The more we're able to respond, the more responsible we are for what we know. Lord Jesus, thank you. Not just that you loved us, not just that you teach us, not just that you heal people, not just that you inspire people, much more than that. Just like you cut right to the chase in this conversation with Peter. Thank you that you gave up your life to exchange that life for our death. We realize now, Jesus, there's no way you could have not given up your life, because we can only get life if you give us your life. Lord, I don't know if people here feel like they're not alive, but we ask that your Spirit would come upon us to help us to realize that life isn't just about muddling through. It's about accepting, receiving, embracing you as our God, maybe for the first time, and in doing that, receiving the life that you gave to us on the cross. This is a miracle. No human being can do it without your help. And so we invite you by your Spirit to share yourself with us so that we host you in us. We already know that God can enter a human person in the person of Jesus. We ask that you would enter our hearts so that we become people who are still human, but also hosting God himself. In Jesus' name, help us. Amen.